David Blackmon is an energy-related public policy analyst and consultant, a 40-year veteran of the oil and gas industry. He's a longtime writer on energy issues, a widely recognized subject matter expert. He has written articles for Forbes.com, The Daily Caller, World Oil Magazine, and The Petroleum Economist. And his podcast, The Energy Question, is phenomenal. I'm a big fan, so thanks for coming on, David.
Oh, thank you for having me. I appreciate it. That's a wonderful introduction.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I wanted to talk to you about was I read a book, one of the very few energy policy books that I've read, and it was Marin Katusa's The Colder War. And in there, he talked about like some of the things that were happening. This was even during the Obama administration, and he had mentioned, kind of the Hillary Clinton giving, what was it, 2/3 of our uranium stockpile to Russia.
Yeah, to Russia. Yeah.
Yeah, and that gave them leverage over, he said, 1 in 5 houses is done by nuclear power. So now, that kind of geopolitically, that was very unwise. And there's 3 states. I saw a recent article, Illinois, New Hampshire, and South Carolina get 50% or more of their energy from nuclear.
Yeah.
And so do you think, my first question to you is, do you think that the government is kind of afraid of promoting nuclear at this point? Just for the fact that it gives leverage now. It didn't used to, but it gives leverage now to kind of geopolitical, adversaries.
Well, it does. And, I'm not sure that that's the big motivator, but it certainly plays a role, I think. One of the other big motivators is just a PR problem that the nuclear industry has suffered from since 3 Mile Island happened in 1979, 44 years ago. No one was killed. In fact, there's no scientific documentation that anyone was even harmed negatively in that event. And yet it still continues, largely because I think the China Syndrome movie came out actually the week before that event happened, and which was an incredible coincidence, I guess we'll call it. And, they've never recovered from that. And then, of course, Chernobyl happened. Chernobyl is now a tourist attraction. It was so awful. And Fukushima happened, which, was the people who died as a result of what happened then was a result of the tidal wave and the earth from the earthquake that had damaged a nuclear facility. But it's been a major catastrophe just as a nuclear event as well. And so those things, people have it in their heads that it's created all sorts of fear, that people have it in their minds that with nuclear, it's a reliable source of energy, but it's so dangerous, the whole world can melt down and we'll all die if we build more nuclear plants. And of course, the new technologies, the new generation of technologies really solve for pretty much all of those issues. But no one understands that yet. And so, our government doesn't want to promote it. European governments don't want to promote it. Germany took this insane act of shutting down their last 3 up and running nuclear plants last March. And so now they're reactivating old coal plants to try to keep the lights on this winter. So
it's just coal. They decommissioned all 17 of their nuclear power plants. Yeah. And now they've quietly gone back to coal.
Just insane, just utter insanity.
Well, one of the things, I read a book called A Century of War by William Engdahl, and it's all about kind of the discovery of petroleum and how that leads into kind of geopolitical posturing, jockeying for position, England trying to cut off Germany from Russian oil, and all the world wars are based around this. Like, for instance, in World War One, the pipeline that was, the Berlin-Baghdad Railroad was going to go from Germany all the way into the Near East. They'd be able to get cheap fuel, and it ran through Serbia. So the English created the Serbian nationalist movement to disrupt that pipeline, and it causes World War One. And same thing with World War II was all about, and I've always wondered that, like, how authentic Hitler was. And I've had many conversations with experts whose expertise goes way beyond mine. But like, for instance, if you read Mein Kampf, he inveighs against Slavs almost more than he does, against another famous group. And so they were talking about cutting off Germany from Russia. and creating this iron curtain so that the two could never create Eurasia, and the British could remain, kind of predominant in the Atlantic. And so even that, like, Hitler served a function of basically doing exactly what the English wanted. And I've always kind of wondered about that, cutting off Germany. And we just saw that again with the Nord Stream pipeline, where
Yeah.
the West is kind of cutting them off from energy. And so all of our world wars, all of our, things have been about energy and about oil, and the current thing in the Middle East right now with Israel, kind of discovering all these oil platforms are now in the Eastern
Right.
Mediterranean around the Levant.
Yeah.
And you're seeing kind of them seizing those
Yeah,
lands.
Daniel Yergin's great book, The Prize, covered a lot of that too, that history. I haven't read the book you just referenced. If you wouldn't mind, after we're finished,
Yeah, sure.
emailing me the details on that, I would love to read it. I'm a big freak about the history of those kinds of things myself. So, but yeah, and that's the thing. Oil has been a strategic resource globally for at least the last 120, 130 years. And when you do read the history of how World War One developed and World War Two as well, almost every major decision Hitler made early on during the late 1930s to invade Poland, all the invasions he did and all the actions he took, his move down south and to try to get control of the oil fields in Kazakhstan. Even his North Africa campaign was largely motivated by trying to control oil supplies and strategic resources of oil. And the same thing was happening in Asia with the war between China and Japan, and Japan's decision to go after the Philippines and all that stuff. It was all motivated by the control of oil as a strategic resource. And towards the end, when you read the history of the Battle of the Bulge, one of the main reasons why the Allies prevailed in that key battle towards the end of World War II was because we were able to keep our supply chains for oil and gasoline to keep our tanks running, and Germany was not. And that was really the decisive factor in that battle.
Yeah, I just talked to a supply chain expert right before you. His name's Jack Buffington, and he just wrote a great book called Reinventing the Supply Chain. And so funny that you bring up, how vital supply chains are to any war, and that's what they did. They cut off all the supply chains. But one of the things that William Engdahl talks about, by the way, in his and by the way, before I go back to William Engdahl, let me just say this because you mentioned Japan. There's a book by H.G. Wells in 1899. He wrote a book called Anticipations, and it is a brilliant book. Just for people watching, H.G. Wells coined the term atomic bomb decades before it was ever invented. And Leos Lazar actually got the idea of nuclear fission from H.G. Wells. Very brilliant man. And so he was talking about in 1899 how the United States was already creating a blockade and embargo around Japan in 1899, and he said that a war will likely happen very soon, and it did. And he also said that England is so under threat by Germany, its industrial capacity, that it would have to kind of come up with a pretext to have a war to take Germany down, because Germany was doing things like England was the old the old imperial model of having colonies and slaves. And so Germany was innovating around that using factories and technology. So if you wanted to get rubber, the 19th century, you would have to go to England or France or one of the big empires that had kind of colonial, outposts in Southeast Asia, getting rubber tree plants and stuff. And then Germany creates synthetic rubber with chemicals for pennies on the dollar. It is cheaper. It is of higher quality. And so people started buying Germany's synthetic rubber, and England was like, okay, this isn't going to last. We got to take them down. So there were these economic things before leading up. So that's an interesting document. 1899. Wells is already
that's
talking
fascinating.
about having to take him down.
That's amazing. H.G. Wells was a real visionary guy. He wrote a lot of stuff that people thought he was crazy for writing, and most all of it turned out to be right.
Yeah, in that same book, he mentions, and I don't want this to turn into an H.G. Wells podcast, but in that same book, he mentions that in the year 2000, he's making predictions for the year 2000, and he talks about how men and women are going to start losing gender differences because the work is going to be different. We're not going to have the heavy, brutish work, so men's muscles would get smaller. He said that their clothes, he said women would probably be wearing pants. He said that men, however, would want to, he said people would dress less formally, but men would still want to have this kind of sporting, heroic thing. So they would like sports teams, and they would probably start wearing sports jerseys with zeros and ones. He also predicted, he said that the technology would change so that we wouldn't have fireplaces. And he said, so a lot of people would have like electric fireplaces, but they would still be nostalgic and probably have synthetic looking logs to make it look like, and I'm like reading this. I mean, his predictions, his prognostications
Pretty
were
amazing. Yeah.
spot on. Yeah. Very, very intelligent, man. But yeah, so, but what I wanted to go back, circle back to William Engdahl, in A Century of War, he talks about how the whole book starts with the Bilderberg group, right? And so the seven sisters are there, the seven largest oil companies, and they're thinking, how do we, make oil, how do we boost our profits? And they wanted to quadruple profits according to Engdahl. And they quintupled them, by the way. And so the thinking was, whatever is scarce becomes more valuable. So let's choke off oil supplies. Let's create some kind of synthetic thing in the Middle East, which is 50 years from the day, by the way, to the hostilities that are happening now in Israel. So back in 1973, and then it just repeated itself in 2023. And so anyway, so they created the 6-Day War. They choke off oil supplies, profits shoot up. And so he points out in the book that a lot of the anti-nuclear stuff comes from the oil companies, and the oil companies created fake green movements. Like one of them, the earliest one, was Friends of the Earth by Robert O. Anderson, who was an oil tycoon. The Aspen Institute was also the creation of oil companies, and so was just recently we've been seeing all these young college students throwing stuff at paintings and destroying things in museums, and it turned out that they were being funded by an oil heiress named Eileen Getty.
Right. The Getty
So a
Foundation,
lot of
right.
this stuff is the oil companies trying to discredit nuclear, trying to discredit so that we're kind of, on their model.
It's been a real interesting phenomenon. The descendants of these big oil families, like the Getty family, the Rockefeller family, and others, create these foundations that end up doing all this work that, at least from all appearances, is against the industry that made them wealthy. The Getty family, probably more than any other, although the Rockefellers are really close. When I was in government affairs for about 25 years in the oil and gas industry, from the mid 90s and, through about 2018, 2019, we, of course, didn't really have much to do with nuclear. I was never asked in all of that time to say anything negative about nuclear. But, what I was doing wasn't really, at that kind of high level within the companies. And so, maybe that's happened. I don't know. I would be interested to read that book, but I don't know about it firsthand.
Yeah, well, I mean, I was talking to a sustainability guy. He's at an investment bank, and I will not name him because I don't want to get him in trouble. And he's a really nice guy, and he's politically, more on the left than I am, but nevertheless a sweet guy. And so I was asking him about sustainability. Like I was, kind of doing some work, and we had some stuff overlapping. We had a great series of conversations. And I said to him, I was like, are they going to, with this ESG stuff, the environmental social governance program that they're trying to bring in? And I was like, are they, going to really get rid of oil and gas? And he was like, no. He was like, they're just going to monetize, they're basically meter it, make it, they're going to choke off supplies, make it really cost prohibitive for average people to run around. They'll, and then you can sell credits.
Well, I think that's
on the
the end
secondary
goal.
markets.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the end goal of all this, is to make energy so expensive that we can't afford to use it. And to, I was asked the other day on a podcast, will we be forced to buy electric vehicles, which is always a question that people are asking these days. And the answer is, well, I think certainly the Biden government wants to eventually get to that point where they can force people to buy nothing but electric vehicles. But in reality, the end goal, when you really listen to what, people like Bill McKibben and some of these, leading disciples of the climate change movement say, what the end goal is really to have you stop driving at all. And that's really what they want to create, is a less mobile society, and governed by an authoritarian government. And they're very frank about saying it if people would just listen to them speak.
Yeah, exactly. I did coverage of the climate change conference, the COP27 conference last November at this time, and they said I was probably one of like 10 people who actually read the 300-page document on the website. I printed it out, I read every page, and it
You're a
was
better
all
man than I am.
yeah, it was all about how do we had nothing to do with saving the planet. It was all they
Right.
said, oh, the three I's, and it was like innovation, insurance was one of the I's, and a guy I can't remember the other I, but that insurance thing that like I was looking at that and I was like, that's curious. And then the more you read the document, the more you realize what they're talking about is derivatives contracts, right? We're already $22 trillion in debt in the hole with derivatives, and they're talking about making more. And so they're talking about catastrophe bonds and social investment bonds and monetization of, because basically the global GDP is like they're worried about the society collapsing. So now they're talking about monetizing and tokenizing water and doing all these things. One of the things I mentioned social investment bonds, they were talking about basically you could bet on, like, say you have a Head Start program. Will the kids get A's? Will they get B's? Will they get C's? Well, you can get a bond for 8%. And if they hit this benchmark, your bond, just like they have catastrophe bonds, where
My
if
God.
there's suddenly a typhoon or a pandemic, people, these things are very lucrative and very, so,
Sure.
yeah.
No, I just said sure. Yeah. I
Oh,
mean, you're
okay.
right. They are. They can be. They
Yeah,
can
we're
also
talking.
be very catastrophic, right? I mean, they can be really catastrophic for the economy if the investments are mismanaged. But I mean, this is what derivatives contracts are basically, I guess, what created the Great Recession in 2008. So, or at least at the center of all that. But none of that really surprises me. I don't really comment on things at that level in my writing, but yeah, this is a very pernicious time for all of us. I think we really need to start really looking at and dealing with this movement with with a clear eye about what its real intentions are, and stop treating these people as if they are good intentioned people who just want a cleaner environment. That's not what they're about at all. It's
No.
not even really doesn't hardly have anything to do with any of this. It's just a wonderful narrative that they spin.
Yeah, well, one of the books, and I'm going to mention it. Sorry, I mentioned so many books, but one of them was
No, this is great.
it was a time to choose, right? So in 1973, McGeorge Bundy, he was the point
Yeah.
man for, he was the national security advisor for Kennedy and Johnson, and then he went to the Ford Foundation. And a lot of the work that he did for the Ford Foundation was about the de-industrialization of America, the chopping off of energy supplies, because they were going to change America from a productive economy into a financial economy, as they headed
Yeah.
toward the 21st century. And he mentions in there, I was very curious, he gives three pathways to the future. One is if we do nothing. One is, if we have technological innovations that help, help us use energy more efficiently. And one is if you do this massive kind of gutting of the United States, you get rid of the paper manufacturers, you get rid of steel, you get rid of all these industries. And he said, he was like, by the year 2000, we'll have, 100 quadrillion British thermal units of energy being used in the United States. So I was curious. So I was reading this from 1973. So I go to Google. I was like, how much, energy does the United States use, as of this year, 2023? And they said 100 quadrillion BTUs of energy. So they got their thing by gutting. And he even says that he was like getting rid of all of these industries, that made us America. Made us like the premier country on the world, the most prosperous, people with a growing middle class that ever existed. And he even says, once we get rid of all of those, industries to cut down on energy usage, he said, you're going to see the economy change. People will be less likely to work in factories, and they'll more likely be working in insurance companies, education, government. He gives a whole list, and he even talks about the gig economy. He said that they're not likely to be able to have as lucrative jobs as under the productive America, so they might get like two or three part-time jobs. And I'm reading this from 1973. So this was done malice aforethought. And one of the things I was reading, a gentleman's book called The Price of Everything, Eduardo Porter. And he talked about when they first started banning factories in the 70s under the EPA, under the aegis of the EPA. And he said the initial thing was sulfur dioxide. They wanted to get rid of sulfur dioxide bad to have these evil factories, and then they quietly send them to China on the same planet, so it's not really affecting
Right. It's
global
not doing any
emissions.
good, but yeah.
Yeah. And he says, but it was just interesting to see how they did it. Right. And so the methodology, like think of a word cloud, right? So you never say to the American people, hey, we're getting rid of factories. So what you do is you have this word cloud around, like what is associated with a factory? Oh, sulfur dioxide or carbon or any of these things. So you get rid of all of the things around it, and you end up getting rid of the noun that those adjectives are describing. Kind of like if you wanted to get rid of cats, you wouldn't tell people, hey, we're going to ban your pet. So we're going to get rid of quadrupeds and things with fur and things with pointy triangular ears and things with tails. Oh no, but we're not getting rid of cats. Oh, that's a conspiracy theory. Totally not getting rid of cat. And then at the end of it, hey, all the cats are gone. Hey, all the factories.
Well, and isn't that exactly what we're doing with coal right now? I mean, in the United States, we're destroying our coal sector. Something like 372 out of what we had 500 coal plants 5 years ago. 372 have either been retired or scheduled to be retired. And so at the same time, China has been approving and building a new coal plant every week for all that period of time. So all we're doing is transferring the emissions from the United States and our energy security from the United States to China, which is what this, again, that's another thing this energy transition is all about, is transferring United States energy security to China and making us completely subservient to China for our energy security. I mean, when you look at all the minerals that are required for the batteries in the cars or in the solar panels, and where do the solar panels come from? China controls all the minerals processing, all the supply chains for all of that. But yet we are, as a country, moving to become completely dependent on those modes of energy. Well, I mean, obviously, what we're doing is transferring our energy security to China. And I have coal on my brain because I just wrote a story about that.
No, that's great. I mean, I love, I just did an audiobook. I recorded an audiobook of Principles of Geology from 1830, Charles Lyell, all 1,200 pages I recorded. And it was the first time I'd read any book
How
on
long did
geology.
that take you to do, by the way?
4 months, maybe.
Oh my God. Okay.
And
wow.
Yeah, but it was an education for me. And but some of the things he gave me some ideas, and I kind of have I'll pitch this idea to you. He talks about 16 miles under the earth or whatever the depth was, and he talks about like the atmospheres of pressure on things, and he was talking about like as you go down, to the certain level, that water has the density of mercury, right? And you go down even further, and it's like it can melt nickel, like all these things under pressure. And so I was curious about that. So I went to a search engine, and I was like, elements behaving differently under pressure. And lo and behold, this article came up from 2019 that common elements on the surface act differently when they're under massive amounts of pressure. And this thought popped into my head. I said, well, what if for those rare earth elements, right, that are really, really hard to find up here, what if we take, like a common element, but then, have it under tremendous pressure? At some point, could we use that as a hack? And
Right,
like if you
right.
could get like dirt, if you could get I don't know, let's say tin to act as if it's uranium or palladium or one of these minerals, it's my idea.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting. That's very interesting. You have a more of a scientific mind than I do, so I don't really understand all that, but it's really fascinating.
No, I don't. I'm an idiot. And somebody
No,
pointed that out. They were like,
apparently not.
it would take a lot of energy to crush that like element down,
Well,
for
yeah.
us to do it on the surface. And I was like,
But I
well,
mean, isn't that the point? The energy comes from the pressure deep below the earth, right? I mean, that is the energy that crushes it, right?
yeah. So yeah,
Yeah.
if you could have a factory down below the earth instead of us having
Yeah.
factories up on the surface, what if we had one way, 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 way down there? Something like that. That was my thought, but I don't know. I doubt that.
Well, you talk about rare earth. One of the things that really concerns me about that is our government doesn't seem to be real interested in trying to obtain our own resource of those things. I mean, in Greenland, for example, the southern part of Greenland, the government of Greenland has already permitted a mining company to mine rare earth minerals. It's the largest known deposit of rare earth minerals on Earth that hasn't been developed yet. And it's been sitting there permitted now since I think 2016. I interviewed the CEO of the company a few months ago. But we can't, and they have reached out to both the Trump and Biden administrations, the Pentagon, the Department of Energy, Interior Department. No one seems to have an interest in securing that resource for the use of the United States. It's barely 200 miles from Maine. It would be the most sensible thing possible to do in that realm, and yet, I mean, and the Pentagon has tremendous need for rare earth minerals, right? I mean, you would think just from a defense standpoint alone, we would rather in the Pentagon have our own resource of these minerals in Greenland than to continue to obtain them from China, which is what we're having to do now. So, I mean, even for our military complex, we are already reliant on China, and no one in the government seems to have an interest in changing that equation, which is very concerning to me.
Yeah, Marin Katusa pointed that out too, the Canadian energy expert who wrote that book that I mentioned at the outset, Colder War. And he said, he was talking about the the abuses of licensing and permitting to essentially, cut the feet, the legs out from under American energy companies. And so there's abundant uranium in the United States, and they're like, oh no, the EPA says you can't do what we're taking and Biden just did that recently to a bunch of energy companies in Alaska. He revoked their licenses, and there was a futurist named Alvin Toffler in 1980. He wrote a book called The Third Wave, and he talked about like totalitarian states, the way that they take over is through licensing and permitting. And so you see that as the growth of the bureaucratic state, they're basically, we're living in abundance. And it's kind of, somebody said that in the 19th century about Mexico. Mexico's the same topography and mineral wealth of Texas, but they stayed poor because they were socialist. And they said Mexico is like a beggar sitting on a bag of gold. And now they're turning the United States into Mexico, where we're sitting on all this wealth, all this mineral wealth, and they're using EPA laws and all these kind of, workarounds to make sure that we're, not energy independent, to make sure that we're poor, to make sure that we're easily rulable, governable. That's
and that's the whole thing, right? They want us to be easily governable, and a population that doesn't have ready access to affordable energy and isn't able to move around, doesn't have transportation, can't go, fly off on trips. A less mobile population is a lot easier to govern than a mobile population by an authoritarian government. And that's the end goal in all of this. And again, it's not like they make any secret about it. It's what they say in public conferences all the time, year after year. And at some point, the rest of us need to start taking these folks seriously.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the things that, that really jumps out at me, regarding there was a gentleman from the CIA, and he was talking about how the CIA basically lost their, his name is Brian Fairchild. And he said the CIA lost its purpose after the collapse of the Soviet Union because they were largely formed to fight the Soviet Union. And he said that the CIA by 95 was already kind of falling apart. And he said it reinvented itself through counterterrorism after 9/11. And it kind of became inward looking. They started paying more attention to the domestic American population and ignoring the international players. And meanwhile, China was building up, or all these other countries, these competitors were building up. And it was totally off the radar because they basically had turned the American population into the terrorists. Now we're going to create this police state. We're just going to concentrate. The American people are the enemy, not the Soviets, not people out there. The American people. We have to have barbed wire fences around the White House, and we have to worry about the Republic and people who read the Constitution are the new terrorists. And so,
well, isn't that what Christopher Wray tells Congress every time he testifies at a hearing? That's exactly what Christopher Wray says.
Except
he's not CIA, he's FBI, but same thing.
Yeah, it's the same model. And but the FBI had always been an apparatus kind of to suppress the American people to some extent in the modern era, not the original FBI, but the modern FBI, unfortunately. But the CIA had always been international. That was its mandate. And then all of a sudden it found itself, like the FBI being FBI 2.0, where instead of being international and paying attention, he said they were shutting down foreign bureaus, and they were doing the peace dividend and cutting all these resources. Right. And so they became ignorant of stuff that was happening around the world, because this is the secret price of tyranny. The secret price of tyranny is you spend so much time obsessing on your own population that you stop looking around at the rest of the world. And I think to a large extent that's kind of happened. And now we're seeing China eat the lunch of the United States, or like Russia is coming up, and Eurasia generally, India, like all these changes are happening. BRICS countries are coming online, and the United States seems, and I could be wrong about this, but it seems like it's like totally caught off guard, with these changes.
Well, I think so. I mean, 9/11, the CIA didn't see coming, had no idea supposedly that it was going to happen. This terrorist attack on Israel on October 7th, CIA claims it had no previous intelligence that anything was brewing. CIA has missed every bit. I mean, the CIA didn't even foresee the fall of the Soviet Union, really. I mean, President at the time, George W. Bush, was not receiving intelligence briefings telling him the Soviet Union was about to fall. And then it fell, and everybody's like, oh, wow, that's cool. Yeah. So, I mean, the CIA misses everything, literally everything. They're surprised by everything that happens now. And it's because of exactly what you're saying. They become inwardly focused rather than outwardly.
Yeah. And so, that, like I said, that's the true price of tyranny is that maybe the true enemy is not the what was he called? The January 6th shaman. Maybe it's not a little old lady with an American flag, maybe that's not, or the FBI had those things as memos about, how to spot a terrorist. And it was people who read classical literature, people who believe in the US Constitution, people who believe in rule of law. And I'm like, these are your enemies.
These are the potential terrorists. Yeah.
Yeah.
Or if you're a good Catholic, apparently the FBI thinks you're a threat.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just extraordinary. It's crazy.
Friend Rebecca is a good Catholic, and she said that she's like, how many lists am I on now with the Constitution and being a Christian?
I'm sure with the Substack I write, I'm on somebody's list somewhere too.
Yeah. Well, okay. Well, you're definitely on my list and my viewers list, and so I'm going to end it there. How can we get a hold of you and find more of your work?
Oh, well, it's pretty easy. I do a Substack. I do two, actually. I have a political Substack where I write about politics. It's David Blackmon, all one word, .substack.com. And then on energy, I keep them separate. The energy Substack is blackmon.substack.com. And I have new content every day. I do a lot of podcasts like this, and do a lot of writing, and have a lot of fun with it.
Well, before I let you go, I'm going to ask you one more thing. What do you see as the future of energy, like in the short term? I know what the actual solution is, but what do you think is actually gonna happen?
Well, I mean, I think we're going to fool around with this charade of going to wind and solar and power generation probably for the rest of this decade until it all completely falls apart. It may happen sooner. Then I think the wind industry is already collapsing. Ørsted is really on the verge of bankruptcy unless the Danish government or other governments bail them out. And so, but after that, what I think and what I hope and what I do believe ultimately will happen is the new generation of nuclear energy that solves for all these problems of the first generation reactors is going to see a dramatic renaissance, and we're going to have a lot of growth in nuclear. Oil and gas, there's so many reasons why you can't just do away with oil and gas. We could spend all day listing them. Is going to continue to be a major part of our energy mix for all of our lifetimes, and probably beyond all of our lifetimes. And wind and solar will be there. They will be the niche industries that their limitations require them to be. Electric vehicle, in transportation, we're going to end up with a mix of electric vehicles, hydrogen vehicles, and gasoline powered vehicles. And what's going to end up happening, assuming all this hyper fear about the trace element of carbon dioxide that's in our atmosphere and humanity's trace element of a trace element contribution to that is accurate, we'll still get most of those emissions out of our system by cleaning up our existing system along with all these innovations. And because ultimately, all these efforts by governments to control the market and dictate to the market are going to fail. And a lot of governments, in addition to companies, are going to go bankrupt in the process of trying to do that. We should all hope the United States isn't one of those countries. A lot's going to depend on, frankly, the next election, the direction that's all going to go for us. But at the end of the day, the market is going to rule in all this. And if wind and solar were such a great idea, we'd already be living with wind and solar instead of an oil and gas economy.
Instead of windy politicians.
Right.
So Germany might
Exactly.
actually be the model where they tried to go green. They spent trillions of dollars, and then all of a
Yeah.
sudden, Oz didn't work, and behind the curtain of the powerful and mighty
Yeah.
Oz was coal. And there's
Exactly.
like coal, and so I don't know. So you're right. So we're probably going to be heading toward that. Okay, well, thank you so much, David, and I hope to have you back soon. And thank you for stopping by.
Thank
You're the
you.
best.
I enjoyed it. It's a great conversation.
I'd like to take a moment to thank you for watching. If you'd like to stay updated, hit the like and subscribe buttons. But more importantly, if you don't want to see me reduced to shilling my old merch, such as the Daniel Natal in action figure, where you can see Daniel engaging in an action as he watches TV, or engaging in an action as he surfs the internet, or failed products like the Daniel Natal Pez dispenser, or the even more ill-considered Daniel Natal urinal cake, think about supporting the show by buying one of my books. For instance, you can buy my book, Actionable Ethics. The link is in the description below.